the war, they were asking for a no-fly zone over Ukraine to stop Russian bombs from falling on their cities. I think he's come to the realization that in order to institute a no-fly zone, you have to be willing to shoot down a Russian fighter jet, right? Someone has to make that no-fly zone happen. Someone has to be the bad guys, and there's just not, as supportive as NATO has been in this conflict, that's not something they've been really careful about trying not to engage Russia directly. One of the other things they've up until this point not been willing to do is send them these Patriot missile batteries as an air defense system. Now, we saw them when we were in Poland. They're right at the border. Actually, the airstrip, it's called Rzeszów, Poland. It's about 4 hours south of Warsaw. The airstrip where the president landed when he visited, when he landed there, we could see the Patriot battery set up around that airstrip. But they're on the other side of the border. And the Americans were very specific about not wanting to antagonize Russia and keeping those systems on the other side. As this conflict has progressed, as it's prolonged, as we've seen the Ukrainians really successfully push back Russian ground forces, but are still getting hit in the cities, civilian targets, power grid. The power grid has really been taking a hammering, and they're hoping by giving them these Patriots that they will be in a better position to fight back against that specifically. Partially, I think, because they've done so well in the ground war. This is the piece that they're missing. This is the piece they can't defend themselves against. So this will be a huge part. We're also seeing this $2 billion aid package, which is the biggest one so far. That's for a couple of reasons. First of all, they need it, but also I think it's uncertain if the new Congress will so readily approve these large numbers, right? So they're trying to get some things in under the wire.
That's a really good point. And in terms of kind of why he's making this trip now, do we have a sense of this kind of timing? I mean, you mentioned that he wants to get this money essentially before the next Congress turns over. Is that it, or are there other things at play?
I mean, I think it's all of the above. We saw a really nice moment in the Oval where President Zelenskyy he said he wanted to thank the president, but he also wanted to thank ordinary Americans, and he's paused for a minute and he said, ordinary Ukrainians want to thank ordinary Americans for their support. And that's something that we have seen. Like we said, generally, most of the public is supportive of supporting Ukraine in this war. But I think Zelenskyy knows that even the best goodwill isn't infinite. And in hard economic times, I think, like we talked about, I think you've got a shift of power in Congress. You've got a president who's going to be approaching either to run again or the end of his term. And I think he wants to get, the getting's, I don't want to say good, but, more likely to benefit them. And he hasn't left the country since the conflict started, right? So if he was going to go anywhere, I think he was going to go here. And I think it's a big moment for this White House, and it's a big moment for Zelenskyy.
And this moment, when we were kind of learning about it yesterday, I mean, there were all sorts of concerns, obviously, about his security. From people that you have been talking to, do those concerns still exist? The idea that it is known that he is coming to the United States, he's here, he is presumably going back. What's kind of the level of concerns about his security? I
mean, look, they always try to keep a lid on these trips. They did a pretty good job with this one, considering it held until about 24 hours beforehand. But it's funny, I was reaching out to some sources in Poland as it was starting to break and asking questions about, is he on his way? And I've never gotten such hardcore, F you, we're not telling you that. Because people on the Polish side, people on the U.S. side, everybody is so protective and so hyper aware of how vulnerable he is to leave the country and his security while he's moving. He took a train to Poland, and then we believe from there he got on a military transport to the U.S. And my understanding is after he makes the speech, he will be going right back. And that's for a couple reasons. We've seen in a lot of uncertain political combat kind of fluctuations in countries, you just don't want the head of state out of the country. It's the optics of it. It just leaves a power vacuum at the top. He's got really good command and control. He seems to have, a loyal group around him. We haven't seen a lot of fluctuations in that group. It's been the same foreign minister, the same generals working with him. You just never know. There's so many uncertainties when you leave the country, and you don't want to give Russia the opportunity. That's the moment to really amp up their bombing campaign, and the optics of, being out of the country while your citizens are under fire is just never good. But obviously, he thought that his messaging here today, his outreach to the American public, was important enough for him to take the risk.
And, what does this mean for Biden? I mean, we've talked a lot before about he campaigned, and then when he came into office, made at this point that America was going to be back, in his words, that, the Biden administration has touted its perceived successes in rallying Europe, rallying allies around them in defending Ukraine and supporting them. What does this mean for Biden at a time where that people had been focused on domestic issues here, and there could be this kind of fear of dissipating support for this kind of thing?
I think you can look at this a couple ways. The Biden administration has been very successful with its Ukraine policy, with what it wanted to do in Ukraine. But one of the things that has hampered them is even before the conflict began, we had the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and we had Biden going out and very clearly saying, I will not put ground troops into Ukraine. And some detractors have said, Vladimir Putin heard that, and that was one of the reasons he decided to go in. And we can argue that point or not. But initially, they were a little bit on the back foot because they had already said, we're not going to engage Russia directly, right? This is what we're talking about, the no-fly zone. We're not going to go in there. We're not going to put ground troops on. So we're going to support Ukraine, but we're going to have a backstage role in this conflict. We don't want to go in and intervene directly. So that's something that the Biden administration has done successfully, given that that was the policy that they wanted to do going in. However, again, it's longevity. No coalition lasts forever, especially when all of these European countries, there have been impacts of this conflict. We've seen gas prices go up in Europe, which makes everyone feel it in their pocketbooks, and all politics are local, even something like this. So you've got leaders in Germany, you've got leaders in Hungary, you've got leaders in Poland fighting a population that is having to pay more every single day and is going to start asking, why are we paying for someone else's war? And so again, that's why we're seeing Zelenskyy here today, because he wants to look these lawmakers in the eye and say, thank you, first of all, and also this is why you're in it. These are the lives that you're saving, and this is the difference that your aid, both, emotional support, military support, and financial support is making in our country.
I mean, and especially as we're heading into winter. And I mean, that is such a concern, obviously, in Europe.
And it is so cold there. It is so, I mean, we were there in February.
Well, I was going to say, kind of bring us back to when you were on the ground. I mean, you spent so much time in Poland. You actually stayed because you were there you were in Europe for the Munich conference.
That's correct, yeah.
Kind of, take us through your reporting at the time, because this has been going on for so long. We seem to forget kind of what those early days were like.
It was really, really uncertain. And, when we were there, so we literally were there the day after the bombs hit because we'd been in Germany for the Munich Security Conference. We were kind of holding because there was still this hope that Lavrov and Blinken, the Russians and the Americans, were going to have another meeting and they were going to be able to stave off this crisis. And, our colleagues in the London Bureau were hearing from their sources. I was hearing from my sources in Ukraine. Nobody believed this was going to happen up until the day it happened. So people hadn't really left. So when we got to the Polish side of the border in the days after, people coming over were they just couldn't believe it. They were just so shocked because in their minds and in a lot of our minds, there seemed to be no real impetus for this war, right? You have the Russians saying they were going in. They had this whole, motivation kind of retroactively put onto a conflict that was, Putin wanted to, whatever Putin wanted to. Anyway. But it wasn't clear. It wasn't like a conflict that people saw coming. And especially because up until this point, Russians and Ukrainians have been so close. And there are so many Ukrainians who live in Russia and so many Russians who live in Ukraine. I'm so sorry, Ukraine. I remember when we were there, my translator was talking to some folks. And at one point I asked her, because I could tell a little bit, but not really. I said, okay, how much of that was Ukrainian and how much of that was Russian? And she said, oh, I don't know. We just speak both when we need to. And that's how fluid the cultures were. And now you're really seeing this division, and you're seeing the longer we were there, and I don't know how much longer we have until we're seeing the president, but the longer we were there, the more people were coming across with a very different attitude. They were less shell-shocked, and it was more like, okay, this is our reality now, and how do we deal with it? And of course, you have to think about the fact that it was mostly women and children because the men of fighting age were prevented from leaving. They all had to stay behind.
And can you give us a sense of, and I know, we don't have that much time, but can you give us a sense of where things are in this conflict at a time that Zelenskyy is making this appeal?
That's a really good question. That's another thing that Zelenskyy is going to be asked by Americans, by members of Congress is, if we keep supporting you, can you win this war? Right. Is it a winnable war? Because it's been fought to an extent to a stalemate, right? Russia has been pushed back largely to a little bit further, but largely to those territories they control. And it seems to be in kind of a static point. So hopefully, I'm sure the Ukrainians are hoping these new weapon systems will help change the status quo. But President Zelenskyy is going to have to convince U.S. lawmakers, especially the more skeptical ones, that this is a fight Ukraine can win, because otherwise, what is the point of continuing this support if in the end it's not going to work? And
issuing some kind of timeline, perhaps,
exactly.
Right?
As we said, goodwill is not infinite.
Right. Is that something that you think that he can give when he's speaking today? Or is that something that, there's just no clear answer? But to your point about needing this assistance to at least be able to get to a point where it's winnable?
I mean, I think what we've seen from the Ukrainian military has been remarkable by all standards. And, even Putin, I think it was either today or yesterday, had a press conference where he admitted, the Russian military made some mistakes in Ukraine. And just the fact that this is one of the biggest standing armies in the world, and Ukraine has been able to not only fight them off, but push them back, gives people a lot of confidence and might be something Zelenskyy can use to argue, like, if we had the right tools, look what we've done with so little, like we can keep doing this, we can win this war.
And we, thank you so much, Christina. We are seeing the president now. We want to take you live now to a CBS News special report.
This is a CBS News special report. Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and President Biden are about to speak together and take questions from reporters at the White House. Zelenskyy arrived in the U.S. earlier today, his first trip outside of Ukraine since the Russian invasion began in late February. The trip, kept under wraps until the very last moment, comes at a pivotal point in the war and for the future of U.S. cooperation with Ukraine. The two leaders met earlier today in the Oval Office to discuss the ongoing conflict, including Ukraine's battlefield capabilities and training the U.S. will continue to supply. President Biden at that meeting announced a new $1.85 billion military aid package that will include, for the very first time, a Patriot missile defense system. The U.S. has provided so far more than $65 billion in economic and military assistance to Ukraine, and lawmakers later this week are set to vote on a year-end spending package that includes another $45 billion in emergency assistance. Zelensky's trip comes 10 months into a brutal war launched by Russia. It has left tens of thousands of those in Ukraine injured or killed, devastation across much of the countryside, and damage to much Ukrainian infrastructure. Later this evening, President Zelenskyy will address a joint meeting of Congress. The two leaders have entered the East Room. Let's listen to their remarks.
President Zelenskyy, I'm honored to welcome you back to the White House. We spent an awful lot of time on the telephone as well as on video, but it's good to see you in person again. And we've been in close and frequent communication throughout this conflict from the very beginning, but it's particularly meaningful to talk with one another in person, look each other in the eye, because leadership through this terrible crisis has inspired the Ukrainian people, as you have done, Mr. President, and the American people and the entire world. This visit to Washington, your first trip outside Ukraine since February, comes as President Putin is escalating his attacks, his brutal attacks, targeting critical infrastructure to make life as hard as possible for not only innocent Ukrainians, but children and young children, and everything from orphanages to schools. It's just outrageous what he's doing. And as we've heard, as we head into the new year, it's important for the American people and for the world to hear directly from you, Mr. President, about Ukraine's fight and the need to continue to stand together through 2023. This visit also falls on the 300-day mark of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. 300 days since Putin launched an unprovoked, unjustified, all-out assault on the free people of Ukraine. 300 days of Ukrainian people showing Russia and the world their steel backbone, their love of country, and their unbreakable determination, and I emphasize unbreakable determination, to choose their own path. To Ukrainian people, I say to them all, you have demonstrated, you've shown your strong stand against aggression in the face of the imperial appetites of autocrats who wrongfully believed they might be able to make might right, and they're not able to do it. Thus far, they've stood alone, and but you haven't stood alone. You have had significant help. We've never stand alone. You will never stand alone. When Ukraine's freedom was threatened, the American people, like generations of Americans before us, did not hesitate. The support from all across this country, Americans of every walk of life, Democrats and Republicans alike, had the resources and to rebound and resounding united way to provide unequivocal and unbending support for Ukraine. Because we understand in our bones that Ukraine's fight is part of something much bigger. The American people know that if we stand by in the face of such blatant attacks on liberty and democracy and the core principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, the world would surely face worse consequences. And as I said, when Putin rolled his tanks into Ukraine in February, American people are prepared to have us stand up to bullies, stand up for freedom. That's who we are as Americans, and that's exactly what we've done. Even before the invasion began and Putin threatened Ukraine by building up his forces, we helped make sure Ukraine would be prepared to defend itself, even before they crossed into Ukraine. We provided a steady stream of defensive weapons, including air defense systems and artillery, ammunition, and so much more. And we've not done it alone. From the very beginning, the United States rallied allies and partners from around the world to stand strong with Ukraine and impose unprecedented, and I emphasize unprecedented, sanctions and export controls on Russia, making it harder for the Kremlin to wage this brutal war. More than 50 nations have committed nearly 2,000 tanks and other armored vehicles, more than 800 artillery systems, more than 2 million rounds of artillery ammunition, and more than 50 advanced multiple rocket launching systems, anti-ship and air defense systems, all to strengthen Ukraine. Together, we provided billions of dollars in direct budgetary support to make sure the Ukrainian government can keep providing basic fundamental services to the Iranian people, like health care, education, and emergency personnel. This includes another $2 billion that in direct budget support from the American people that the World Bank distributed earlier this week. We provided humanitarian assistance to help the millions of Ukrainians who have been forced to flee their homes because of Putin's inhumane, brutal war. Communities across Europe have opened their hearts and their homes to help Ukrainians in need. The United States has been proud to welcome more than 221,000 Ukrainians seeking refuge since March of 2022, including as part of Uniting for Ukraine, as part of our Uniting for Ukraine program. And today, USAID is committing more than $374 million in urgently needed humanitarian assistance for Ukraine. This will help provide food and cash assistance for more than 1.5 million Ukrainian people, as well as access to health care, safe drinking water, and help stay warm in the winter for more than 2.5 million Ukrainians. The United States and our allies and partners around the world have delivered a broad range of assistance at historic speed and has been critical to bolstering Ukraine's success thus far. Ukraine has won the Battle of Kyiv, has won the Battle of Kherson, has won the Battle of Kharkiv. Ukraine has defied Russia's expectations at every single turn. And President Zelenskyy, you have made it clear that he is open to pursuing, well, let me put it this way. He's not open, but you're open to pursuing peace. You're open to pursuing a just peace. We also know that Putin has no intention of stopping this cruel war. And the United States is committed to ensuring that the brave Ukrainian people can continue to defend their country against Russian aggressions as long as it takes. And I want to thank the members of Congress for their broad bipartisan support to Ukraine. And I look forward to signing the omnibus bill soon, which includes $45 billion in additional funding for Ukraine. I'll also sign into law the National Defense Authorization Act, which includes authorities to make it easier for the Department of Defense to procure critical munitions and defense materials for Ukraine and other key materials to strengthen our national security. Today, I'm announcing the next tranche of our security assistance to Ukraine. $1.85 billion package of security assistance that includes both direct transfers of equipment that Ukraine needs, as well as contracts to supply ammunition Ukraine will need in the months ahead for its artillery, its tanks, and its rocket launchers. Critically, in addition to these new capabilities, like precision aerial munitions, the package will include a Patriot missile battery, which will train Ukrainian forces to operate as part of the ongoing effort to help bolster Ukraine's air defense. This could take some time to complete the necessary training, but the Patriot battery will be another critical asset for Ukraine as it defends itself against Russian aggression. Altogether, today's new security assistance with humanitarian funding amounts to $2.2 billion in additional support for the Ukrainian people. We should be clear about what Russia's doing. It is purposefully attacking Ukraine's critical infrastructure, destroying the systems that provide heat and light to the Ukrainian people during the coldest, darkest part of the year. Russia is using winter as a weapon, freezing people, starving people, cutting them off from one another. It's the latest example of the outrageous atrocities the Russian forces are committing against innocent Ukrainian civilians, children, and their families. And the United States is working together with our allies and partners to provide critical equipment to help Ukraine make emergency repairs to their power transmission systems and strengthen the stability of Ukraine's grid in the face of Russia's targeted attacks. We're also working to hold Russia accountable, including efforts in Congress that will make it easier to seek justice for Russia's war crimes in Ukraine. Let me close with this. Tonight is the fourth night of Hanukkah, a time when Jewish people around the world, President Zelenskyy and many of the families among them, honor the timeless miracle of a small band of warriors fighting for their values and their freedom against a much larger foe, and how they endured and how they overcame. How the flame of faith, with only enough oil for one day, burned brightly for 8 days. A story of survival and resilience that reminds us that the coldest days of the year, that light will always prevail over darkness, and hope drives away despair. And that the human spirit is unconquerable as long as there are good people willing to do what is right. This year has brought so much needless suffering and loss to the Ukrainian people. But I want you to know, President Zelenskyy, I want you to know that all the people of Ukraine to know as well. The American people have been with you every step of the way, and we will stay with you. We will stay with you for as long as it takes. What you're doing, what you've achieved, it matters not just to Ukraine, but to the entire world. And together, I have no doubt we'll keep the flame of liberty burning bright, and the light will remain and prevail over the darkness. Thank you for being here, Mr. President. We're going to stand with you.
Thank you. Шановний пане президенте.
Dear Mr. President, please put on the equipment. Once again, Mr. President, President Biden, audience, journalists, ladies and gentlemen, I came here to the United States to forward the word of thanks to the people of America, people who do so much for Ukraine. I am thankful for all of this. This visit to the United States became really a historic one for our relations with the United States and the American leadership. In the last 30 days of this war, we have started a new phase of our interrelations with the United States. We became a real partners and allies with the content. And I felt today during all of my meetings and during our talks. Once again, I would like to thank Mr. President, President Biden, for his candid support and what is very important, the understanding of Ukraine, and for the support of the international coalition to strengthen international law. I am grateful to President Biden for for his personal efforts, his steps that unite the partners and global South. When all countries of the world take some position and are focusing on cooperation and mutual understanding, this is very useful for all of the countries, for Ukraine, for the United States. I want to thank the Congress for bipartisan, bicameral support, and I am looking forward to good meetings with the members of the Congress and their support. This is the visit that I'm here today to meet with the Congress. The main issue during my today's talks is to strengthen Ukraine. Next year, our movement forward to fight for our freedom and independence. I have good news returning home. President Biden announced a new package of defense support, about $2 billion, and the strongest element of this package is the Patriot battery systems, something that will strengthen our air defense significantly. This is a very important step to create a secure airspace for Ukraine, and that's the only way we would be able to deprive the terrorist country and their terror attack to strike our energy sector, our people, and our infrastructure. We had a very good negotiation and talks about our strategic steps, which we discussed with President Biden, and what we expect next year and for what we are preparing. This is very important for all Ukrainians, and I am hopeful. And once again, thank you, Mr. President, for $45 billion, because this is a big assistance, and I hope that the Congress will approve this financial assistance for our country. This is almost $45 billion. Thank you very much for the support. Every dollar of this investment for the United States is going to be a strengthening of global security. I know that the American leadership will be strong and will play an important role in global scope. And the United States will help us to defend our values and independence. And regardless of changes in the Congress, I believe that there will be bipartisan and bicameral support. And I know that everybody works for this. And of course, during all of my meetings today, we discussed issues of standoff against terror of Russia, their destruction of our energy infrastructure. We need to survive this winter. We need to protect our people, and we need to be very specific in this area. This is a key humanitarian issue for us right now. This is the survival issue. We are discussing sanctions and legal pressure on the terrorist country Russia. Russia needs to be held accountable for everything it does against us, against our people, against Europe and the whole free world. And it is very important that we have the peace formula, and for that we offer very specific steps what America can do to help us to implement them. We propose global formula for peace summit. I'm thankful for our American counterparts that they feel us and understand how important it is to continue and stay on course and work on integrity of the country and international rule of law. We will also need, as soon as our defense capabilities will be strengthened in the next few months, I don't want to discuss it in details right now. I believe you understand why, but I am very grateful to President Biden. Thank you for your attention to all of these issues. Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We're going to take questions from 4 different reporters. I'm going to start with Alex of Yahoo News.
Thank you, Mr. President. In 2022, you presided over a bipartisan international coalition to support Ukraine. How will you keep that coalition from fraying in 2023? And President Zelenskyy, welcome to Washington on this beautiful winter day. What is your message to the American people?
Well, answering your questions first, I'm not at all worried about holding the alliance together, NATO and the European Union, as well as other nations.
Європейського Союзу.
I assume this is simultaneous. All right. Okay. I've never seen NATO or the EU more united about anything at all, and I see no sign of there being any change. We all know what's at stake here. Our European partners, all the more so. They fully understand it. This is about, we've never seen a major invasion of a European country since World War II. And they see no signs that Putin is going to do anything to change that unless we resist and we help the Ukrainians resist. We all know what's at stake, the very idea of sovereignty, the UN Charter. Putin thought he would weaken NATO. Instead, he strengthened NATO. I once said to him that we talk about he wanted to see the, Europe end up being divided. And instead, what did he do? He produced a more united Europe with Sweden and Finland joining. So I don't see any reason to believe there'll be any lessening of support. And as we reach out to our NATO allies, our Secretary of Defense and our Secretary of State, we get continued support, not only there, but also from around the world, from Japan and many other countries as well. So I feel very good about the solidarity of support for Ukraine.
Thank you for your question. Thank you very much. You asked me what is the message to American people. I think I will tell you very simple things, which are very important for me. And I think so that we have the same values and the same understanding of the life, the sense of the life. My message, I wish you peace. I think that is the main thing, and you understand it only when the war in your country, when somebody like these terrorists from Russia come to your houses. And I wish you an adult, and I wish you to see your children when they will go to universities and to see their children. I think that is the main thing what I can wish you. And of course, to be together with us, jointly, because we really fight for our common victory against this tyranny. That is real life, and we will win. And I really want win together. Thanks so much. Not want, sorry, I'm sure.
You call on one of your people, press person?
Yeah. Будь ласка. Галинтер.
Yeah, thank you. Dmitry Anopchenko, Ukrainian television. President Zelenskyy, President Biden, I got a question to both of you, but firstly, as Ukrainian, and I mean it, I want to thank the United States for supporting my country. And, my family is in Ukraine, and I definitely understand they will not be alive today if America will not support my country, both politically and militarily. So thank you for this. It's honest. And as of my question, we enter a new phase of this war, and you definitely discussed today which path to choose, how the war could come to an end, and what's next. Will it turn into a new counteroffensive or some kind of peace talks? So, Mr. Biden, Mr. Zelenskyy, could you share your vision? What's the fair way to end this war, and how do you understand this word, fair peace? Thank you.
My view.
Your guy.
I think we have. I see.
Although I like him very much already.
Ви розпочали це запитання.
Started this question.
I'm sorry. Sometimes I switch on my native language. Ви почали з того, що ви
You have
сказали, що
started by stating that your family is in Kyiv and without the assistance of the United States. This is absolutely true. The U.S. leadership in this assistance is strong, and again, I would like to remind you that your family will be in danger without the armed forces of Ukraine, which is very important. That concerns your questions per se. What would you like to hear? Just peace? I don't know. I don't know what just peace is. It's a very philosophical description. If there is a just war, I don't know.
ви знаєте, для нас, для всіх,
For all of us, peace,
Для мене, як для президента,
just peace is different. For me, as a president, just peace is no compromises as to the sovereignty, freedom, and territorial integrity of my country,
російська агресія.
the payback for all the damages inflicted by Russian aggression. I'm sorry, I'm talking about children a lot today, but as a father,
Ви знаєте,
I would like to emphasize, how many parents lost their sons and daughters on the front lines. So what is just peace for them?
для них
Money
їх не
is
цікавить ніяке
nothing,
відшкодування.
and no compensations or reparations are of no consequence. They live by revenge. Отже, I think this is a tremendous tragedy, and the longer the war lasts, the longer this aggression lasts, there will be more parents who live for the sake of vengeance or revenge. And I know a lot of people like that. So there can't be any just peace in the war that was imposed on us by these, I don't know how to describe that because we are in the White House and I can't find the proper language. So these inhumans, I would say.
Let me respond. I think we share the exact same vision, and that a free, independent, prosperous, and secure Ukraine is the vision. We both want this war to end. We both want it to end. And as I've said, it could end today if Putin had any dignity at all and did the right thing and just pulled out. But that's not going to happen. Not going to happen. It's not going to happen now. So what comes next? What we talked about today was we're going to continue to help Ukraine succeed on the battlefield. It can succeed in the battlefield with our help and the help of our European allies and others. So that if and when President Zelenskyy is ready to talk with the Russians, he will be able to succeed as well because he will have won on the battlefield. And, I don't think we should underestimate the impact this war is having on Russia and the losses they're suffering. And you saw just, I think it was 2 days ago, Putin saying that this is much tougher than he thought. He thought he could break NATO. He thought he could break the West. He thought he could break the alliance. He thought he could be welcomed by the Ukrainian people that were Russian-speaking. He was wrong, wrong, and wrong. He continues to be wrong. The sooner he makes it's clear that he cannot possibly win this war, that's when the time we have to put this president in a position to be able to decide how he wants the war to end. My turn, huh?
Please, yeah.
Phil Matterly, Matt Matterly of CNN.
Thank you, Mr. President. Welcome, Mr. President. Mr. President, to start with you, your advisors often talk about how critically important you view face-to-face interaction. I'm wondering, after spending 2+ hours face-to-face with President Zelenskyy, what you learned or what you took from the meeting that perhaps you couldn't glean or learn in the phone calls or video conferences, and somewhat tied to that, was there any discussion related to the U.S. assessment that Russia would not take escalatory action now that Patriots are being sent, a Patriot battery will be delivered?
Let me answer the first question, the first part of your question. You know I get kidded for saying that there's all politics is personal. It's all about looking someone in the eye, and I mean it sincerely. I don't think there's any substitute for sitting down face to face with a friend or a foe and looking them in the eye. And that's exactly what's happening at this moment. We've done that more than once, and we're going to continue to do it. And the winter is setting in, and Putin is increasingly going after civilian targets and women and children, orphanages. This guy is, well, but he's going to fail. And he's going to fail. He's already failed because he now knows that there's no way he's ever going to occupy all of Ukraine. There's no way in which he's going to be accepted by the Ukrainian people. And so he's failed in the past, and it was very important for him and everyone else to see that President Zelenskyy and I are united, two countries together, to make sure he cannot succeed. And I think I may be mistaken, but I know I judge every leader by the way what they say to me, their consistency, and look him in the eye. This guy has to his very soul is who he says he is. It's clear who he is. He's willing to give his life for his country, and all the folks that came with him today. And so I think it's important for him to know we are going to do everything in our power to see that he succeeds.
Thanks.
What was the second part of your question?
I just asked if you had discussed how the U.S. calculated the escalatory effect of sending a Patriot missile battery to Ukraine.
I did not discuss that at all with the president, but we do not. It's a defensive system. It's a defensive weapon system. It's not escalatory. It's defensive, and it's easy to not. And we'd love to not have to have them use it. Just stop the attacks.
President Zelenskyy, again, welcome. You mentioned earlier that you wanted to make this trip for a while now. Why now? And also, can you tell me what you think the message you are sending to President Putin is, given the fact that 24 hours ago you were on the ground in the front lines with artillery echoing behind you, and now you find yourself in the White House standing next to the president?
Thank you very much for your question. As to what is the message for Putin? I am standing here in the United States with President Biden on the same podium because I respect him as a person, as a president, as a human being for his position. And for me, this is a historic moment. I can send messages to President Biden. For example, if it's not serious, you said, what's going to happen after Patriots are installed? After that, we will send another signal to President Biden that we would like to get more Patriots.
That is our life. We are in war. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. That is my appreciation. Що стосується президента Путіна.
President Putin. In 2019, we had a Normandy meeting. In 2019, I became the president of Ukraine, and at that time, we were sending maximum messages to President Putin, telling him that there shouldn't be a full-scale invasion, to stop aggression, to renew our territorial integrity, to find diplomatic solution. Or, God forbid, we should not have a full-scale war. At that time, he said it won't happen. He was lying. So what kind of message I can send him after he actually destroyed our life, is destroying our life? He can even go further, somewhere where the Soviet Union stayed before this, so he might want to invade those territories too. I believe that there is something mortal about his inadequate approach to the world. Why we need to send him a message. He needs to be interested in getting attention from the world, because he is not a subject of civilized people. He should be interested in trying to save something of his culture and history of his country. So that's his problem now.
This will be the last question.
Olga Koshelenko, 1+1 TV channel. When the full-scale invasion started, U.S. officials said that Ukraine cannot receive Patriots because, as you said, it might be unnecessary escalation. And now it is happening. Right now, today, it is happening. And now Ukraine desperately needs more capabilities, including long-range missiles, ATACMS. Maybe I sound naive, but can we make a long story short and give Ukraine all capabilities it needs and liberate all territories rather sooner than later? Thank you.
Well, his answer is yes.
I agree.
Let me be straightforward with you here. Look, the fact is that it's important to remember that before Russia invaded, we dedicated an enormous amount of security assistance to Ukraine. And we've given Ukraine what they needed when they needed to defend themselves. And since the invasion, that has resulted in more than $20 billion in terms of security assistance. Just today, I approved another $1.8 billion in additional assistance to Ukraine for it to succeed on the battlefield. And we're focused on working with allies and partners to generate capability in 4 key areas. Air defense, as we know today, the Patriot is the best of that. Secondly is to, and we're looking to do more, we provided hundreds of advanced artillery systems and from dozens of countries. Thirdly, we've worked with partners to get Ukraine tanks and other armored vehicles. And fourthly, we've announced today another 200,000 rounds of additional ammunition. Now you say, why don't we just give Ukraine everything there is to give? Well, for 2 reasons. One, there's an entire alliance that is critical to stay with Ukraine. And the idea that we would give Ukraine material that is fundamentally different than is already going there would have a prospect of breaking up NATO and breaking up the European Union and the rest of the world. We're going to give Ukraine what it needs to be able to defend itself, to be able to succeed and succeed in the battlefield. And the other piece of this is, you may recall, one of the reasons why I have spent, well, I won't tell you the calculation, but I've spent several hundred hours face-to-face with our European allies and the heads of state of those countries, and making the case as to why it was overwhelming in their interest that they continue to support Ukraine. They understand it fully, but they're not looking to go to war with Russia. They're not looking for a third world war, and I think they can all be avoided by making sure that Ukraine is able to succeed in the battlefield. So anyway, there's more to say, but I probably already said too much. Thank you. Well, thank you all very, very much. Appreciate your time and attention. And as I said, Mr. President, you don't have to worry. We are staying with Ukraine as long as Ukraine is there. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats until the official delegations have departed.
From President Biden and Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, this message: the stakes in Ukraine and its besieged war against Russia, the one that Russia set in motion in late February, sovereignty, liberty, and the future of international law. And in that matter, President Biden predicted that Russian President Vladimir Putin, who launched this war, will fail. And President Zelenskyy, when asked about what a just peace is, said he doesn't know what that could be because this is an unjust war, and that he wants to prevail on the battlefield. Joining me here at the table, Face the Nation moderator and Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Margaret Brennan. That last question, Margaret, honed in on the essence of what the future of this conflict may or may not look like. A Ukrainian journalist asked President Biden, why not give Ukraine everything it needs? Because with this announcement of one Patriot missile defense system, the United States is ruling in something it had previously ruled out. That seems to be the heart of this whole matter.
That's right. The United States is the pace setter when it comes to arming Ukraine. European countries look to the U.S. and say, what have the Americans given? And then they give behind that. But really, the essence is, if you want the war to end, which is Zelensky's position, let's win on the battlefield. President Biden was a bit on the defensive there in responding to that question, because that reporter zeroed in on exactly the system she knows Zelensky is asking for, the ATACMS, the surface-to-air tactical missiles that could be used offensively. And that is what makes the Europeans uncomfortable. When President Biden was talking about there's an entire alliance and that this could risk breaking it apart, he's referring to the idea that some in Europe are afraid still of this escalating into a direct conflict with Russia that could draw in NATO. That has been the boogeyman that has kept the West from directly intervening in this war. But let's be clear, the United States, as you laid out, Major, has poured in, once Congress approves this package, about $100 billion in financial aid, largely in the form of weapons, but also in the form of intelligence, also in the form of just keeping the lights on. It costs about $5 billion a month just to keep that government up and running and not imploding, and also just to keep some lights on for some part of the day. It's 26 degrees in Kyiv right now. It is freezing. And about 70% of that country only has about 3 hours of electricity per day. We're
going to go to Ed O'Keefe in the East Room in just 1 second. But, Margaret, is there not tension between the representations from President Biden? We want to give Zelensky the wherewithal to negotiate something based on strength and not providing everything that Zelensky says he needs to achieve that?
There is, and I thought you heard a little bit of edge in President Zelensky's voice when he was asked about that term. I don't know what just peace is. And talking about that you can't talk about a financial package that does away with the pain that parents feel. But President Biden did smooth that over, saying we both want to get to the same place, and this will be on Ukraine's terms. But he is revealing a bit of the tension behind the scenes with the United States trying to see if there is any diplomatic pathway forward. And to date, the CIA director most recently met with his Russian counterpart and said there is no sign of diplomacy at this point. The war's not going in Russia's direction, but Vladimir Putin's not folding.
In the East Room, our Ed O'Keefe, our senior White House correspondent and political correspondent. Ed O'Keefe, give us the atmosphere and your take on what just played out before your eyes.
Well, I think, as Margaret said, a pretty stark contrast there in where Ukraine would like President Biden to be and where President Biden and the Western world, in essence, are in terms of their willingness to engage in this as much as they can. The Patriot missile battery today is a big symbolic and operational step, and one that the president was happy to talk about. But you saw President Zelensky say, give me more. We need it. There is an unwillingness to go there for all the reasons that Margaret laid out. But there's also a growing unwillingness in this town, among Republicans at least, to continue writing such big checks with very little accountability. But watch tonight for what the Ukrainian president says when he addresses Congress, specifically to those skeptics in the room, if they're even in the room, because we've heard today some Republicans will skip the address so as to not even be there to show him support. How big that group of Republicans is, or how grim it will be going into the new year when Republicans control the House, is unclear, but it is something you heard him speak to today and that President Biden is going to have to be sensitive to going forward. The White House was able to hold this surprise visit under wraps until about 24 hours ago, when word leaked and quickly brought all of the various logistics together. The formal invitation was made to Zelensky last Wednesday. He accepted on Friday. Congressional leaders were informed on Sunday, and he's here today. The expectation is Zelensky will head back to Ukraine on a U.S. military aircraft later tonight. Major.
Ed O'Keefe and the East Room, we thank you very much. Margaret Brennan here at the table with me. Our thanks to you. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. Then CBS News will have live coverage of President Zelensky's address to a joint meeting of Congress. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Good day.
And you've just been watching a CBS News special report of the press conference between President Joe Biden and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The two leaders met during Zelensky's first known trip abroad since the war in Ukraine began. So for more on this, let's turn to CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini, who's here with me at the desk, and CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane, who also joins us from Washington. Christina, let's kind of unpack a little bit of this.
There's a lot
there. But basically, you heard from the President Biden, that we are in this for as long as it takes. You heard him talk about the significance of meeting Zelenskyy in person. They've talked a number of times, to say the least. But that, as we were talking, seemed to be the moment that Zelenskyy came here for.
Right. It's funny. You and I were listening to the speech and saying, like, it's so interesting that he wanted to come here. And just as we were saying that, we heard Zelenskyy say, I wrote it down, and to be here standing on the stage at the same time as President Biden, that's something President Putin is going to see. That's something Ukrainians back home are going to see. And although there has been this close relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine, between Presidents Biden and Zelenskyy, nothing quite hammers that message home like a joint press conference in the White House, right? Like standing up at the podium, you're equals, you're both presidents, you are both representing your countries, and you are on the same page with this very important issue. And that's something that I think both President Biden and President Zelenskyy really wanted to drive home to their respective audiences.
And we've been talking about that audience. It's the American people, it's American lawmakers who he will speak to later today. But what he is asking for, and he said it again there, is not only financial support, but support in terms of artillery, weapon systems. He's getting some of that. But talk to us a little bit about what exactly he's asking for on that front, and why it could be complicated to kind of administer it right away.
Right. Well, listen, I'm not our esteemed Pentagon colleague, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. That's David Merton territory. But you can't just hand someone a Patriot missile battery. I mean, I remember I'd been told it was a complicated system, but I remember seeing one for the first time. It's not just like a stack of rockets that you push the thing and it goes off. They're not even rockets. It's a very complicated system, and you have to have training on it, which the Ukrainians do not. And because the U.S. has said it doesn't want its troops in Ukraine physically, that means that whoever they're going to have trained on the system is going to have to leave. They're either going to have to go to Poland or a nearby NATO ally that has these systems so they can get trained, so that they can use them properly before they and the system can be sent back in. The other thing that we heard that's a little less sexy, if you will, but is crucially important, is some of this money is going to artillery. And we also heard the Brits are giving, I wrote it down as well, a $304 million package of artillery assistance. One of the reasons for that is the NATO allies, the NATO alliance, the U.S., no one had really been preparing for a ground war in Europe. So the shells, the ammunition, these more basic weapons, they're just running out of because the Ukrainians have fired them all. So they are really, really low on artillery, and that's something that they're really needing to kind of backfill and get ramped up quickly so they can keep fighting the Russians on the battlefields.
Well, you mentioned, too, that he is trying to show this alliance with the president. Scott, later tonight, he's going to head to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue and address members of Congress in a joint session. What is he expecting to talk about in this speech tonight?
Well, he's got a couple different audiences when he speaks to Congress. He has the Congress that right now is planning to vote on a bill that will provide tens of billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine, including for this war effort. I mean, they're on the precipice of a big vote in Congress, either in the hours or the days after President Zelenskyy speaks to them. But there's a more narrow audience. I think that's important. The U.S. House Republican Conference, which in 12 days becomes the majority in the U.S. House and will have the power of the purse, the ability to appropriate whatever it deems necessary. And some members of that Republican conference have been equivocating whether they want to continue robust, at least this robust, a set of funding for Ukraine. So there's a concern on the world stage about whether Congress will continue to dole out money that clearly President Zelenskyy says he needs. So there may be a more targeted demographic inside the House chamber tonight during this joint meeting.
And Scott, that's a really important point here, because you heard Mitch McConnell earlier today saying that the #1 priority is being there for Ukraine. He, of course, represents, what used to be kind of considered under the Trump administration as the old guard of the Republican Party. But, you saw Republican leadership, at least on the Senate side, echoing the support for Ukraine. How big of a faction is this resistance within the Republican Party? Does it threaten to grow?
Doesn't have to be large to be impactful or pivotal. The incoming Senate for the 118th Congress is an awful lot like the one that we have right now in the 117th Senate. Nearly as many members, the same political complexion. There's little concern the next Senate will do anything different than this Senate when it comes to Ukraine, which is to robustly fund it. But the new U.S. House is quite different. It has a very narrow majority, just a handful of members, which really does give a handful of members some form of veto power over almost everything, including appropriations, the funding of things. Two factors to keep in mind. First of all, when it comes to helping a U.S. ally overseas, there's often a bipartisan coalition that can be formed. Democrats are certainly going to want to help out as long as Republicans don't put poison pills in the funding bills to help Ukraine. Put that aside. Spoke today with Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick of the Philadelphia area, a moderate Republican who heads the Problem Solvers Caucus. He's the Republican who leads that group. He said he's being an emissary to these House Freedom Caucus members, these hardliners who've said they have second thoughts about giving more money to Ukraine. So there's already an emissary from leadership to try to work on those members. And Mr. Fitzpatrick says trying to educate them about what this money really does. Fitzpatrick says, like everybody in the House Republican Conference and likely everybody in Congress, he'd like transparency, too, on how that $45 billion in aid is going to be spent, how future money is going to be spent. But note, Caitlin, that there is an emissary trying to bridge the divide inside the House Republican Conference at a particularly pivotal time.
Scott, I wanted to ask you, because we heard President Biden say, all politics are personal, and that's why he really wanted, there was no substitute to face-to-face meetings. He wanted to sit in the same room with this person he's been speaking to over Zoom, over the phone for months and months now. But I've been saying all politics are also local, right? The presidents each have their own respective audiences. But I'm wondering if you think Zelenskyy, who can be an incredibly effective communicator, is going to go to the Hill and lay almost a successful guilt trip on some of these members who may be reluctant to vote for his funding.
I think, first of all, Christina, just like we saw in the East Room, the optics of President Zelenskyy standing in front of the U.S. House chamber speaks to the world stage. It can galvanize U.S. allies to help as well. What a powerful image of President Zelenskyy side by side with President Biden, and then later in front of 535 members of Congress inside the U.S. House chamber. It's an important image. Can he speak to what resonates with some of these House members' constituents? I don't know, because what some of these members of Congress who've tried to draw a line and say maybe we cut back on Ukrainian aid would tell you is that they are just speaking for their constituents who'd rather see taxpayer money spent on domestic things, combating crime, on border issues, fighting fentanyl, ensuring the defense and the homeland security here in the United States. If there's a member of Congress who's trying to educate the House Freedom Caucus about the needs of Ukraine, they may need to educate the constituents who may not recognize the scope and size of what President Zelenskyy is facing and who may have a take care of our hometown first with our tax money mentality.
And Scott, can you kind of take us back into history a little bit? I mean, you and I were both on Capitol Hill earlier this year when Zelenskyy addressed this Congress in a joint session, but via video. How rare is it for a foreign leader to come and address Congress in this way?
We only see this a few times each Congress, a few times each year. The remarks you referenced in March, which we both attended, were virtual. President Zelenskyy appeared on a big screen. But it was nevertheless quite a moment in that room, in the Capitol Visitor Center. There was a standing ovation. There were Democrats sitting next to Republicans. What a rare thing that is. At a distinctively politically toxic moment that we were experiencing in March, it kind of bridged a divide. It has the capability of doing that tonight as well.
And Christine, obviously, Zelenskyy has we talked a lot about his history as a comedian who came into this role of leadership.
Right, there were a couple light moments there.
Exactly. I mean, has become kind of giving a masterclass in communication, right? Figuring out creative ways to communicate and kind of capture the world's attention. Do you expect a little more of that? Did you see a little bit of that as he was addressing the press just there?
I think so. It was hard because there is a language barrier, and we saw in the Oval, he spoke in English but didn't take questions. And I think based on what he said at the Munich Security Conference, he likes to be very precise with his language.
Okay.
And I think anybody who's, speaks a second language, I speak one very badly, and I could give a speech in it that I'd written down, but if people were lobbing questions at me, I would be nervous. I would misunderstand them. So that was what we heard from him in Munich, where he wanted a translator. So it was a little hard to quite get his full, fervor and passion, because I think he was trying to be precise with his language and what he said. But we saw a couple moments where he was asked about the Patriot systems. The presidents were asked about, what has changed in the calculation, and are they not still concerned that this will escalate things with Russia? And Zelenskyy said, we've asked for a Patriot today, and I'm going to ask for another one, because, and that's something we even heard from one of the journalists. The very last question on the Ukrainian side was, okay, you said you weren't going to give us Patriots. Now you're giving us Patriots. Can we just cut to the chase already? And can you just give us everything you can so we can win this war? And that's the conundrum both the Ukrainians and the Biden administration to some point find themselves in, is they want the Ukrainians to win this war. But the alliance, which President Biden was asked about, he said he thinks it's strong. He doesn't see any cracks in it. He thinks it will endure. It is still tenuous, and the allies are not all agreed on the level of involvement for the alliance. So it's you got to get everybody on the same page before you can hand them a weapons system, which they've obviously done with the Patriots. But as President Biden said, there are other things that they could give the Ukrainians that would threaten that alliance. And the alliance is more important than the individual weapon systems at this point.
And these are, fair questions to ask about, accountability for this kind of money and these kinds of resources, some kind of timeline, what does winning look like? What is the end goal here? I do want to play a bite from President Biden, though, kind of talking about the significance of, being nearly a year into this war.
300 days since Putin launched an unprovoked, unjustified, all-out assault on the free people of Ukraine. 300 days of Ukrainian people showing Russia and the world their steel backbone, their love of country, and their unbreakable determination, and I emphasize unbreakable determination, to choose their own path.
So Biden there saying, just kind of taking stock of this moment. And I was thinking about the last time that Zelenskyy addressed Congress virtually, he played a video that I think, everyone was struck by, showing the devastation, showing these cities before and after. Biden also kind of mentioned the battles that have been won, the successes that Ukraine has had. It seemed to kind of look at what they have been able to do with what we have given them. Was that kind of a way to kind of push lawmakers essentially to kind of stay in this and push allies to stay in this, kind of showing what they've accomplished?
I mean, I think so, and Scott can answer more about lawmakers, but I think he's also trying to get the American public to stay in this. They've had for an administration that is literally under fire. They've had an incredible communications team, and they've had an incredible social media campaign with some of these videos, with Twitter tweeting out some of the devastation that we've seen, and in some places happening in real time. And that's something that people are going to see on their phones as they go about their daily lives. And to Scott's point, lawmakers in some districts may have, as we talked about, all politics are local, and that may be their priority, but this is a way to get into the hearts and minds of Americans, and that's one of the reasons you're going to see him give these remarks tonight in English, because his audience is not Ukraine. His audience is you, is me, is Scott, and is all those people watching at home.
Speaking of Congress, Scott, this long-term spending plan that we've been covering all week, that you've been covering all week, includes about $45 billion of aid to Ukraine. Can you give us some more details about what exactly is being considered in this spending package?
Well, let's go, first of all, with the aid to Ukraine. That is $45 billion, not in perpetuity, but through October. This big spending bill only buys us about 9 to 10 months worth of federal government spending. There are many other things included as well. About half of that $1.7 trillion is for the American military and the U.S. Department of Defense. Included in that $858 billion you see there on your screen is a service member pay raise, long sought after at a time of inflation, a pretty important thing as well. There are other non-spending items in there. There are almost countless non-spending items in there. I mean, among other things, it reforms the Electoral Count Act. They're trying to change how the electoral votes are counted on future January 6ths. There's a provision to ban the use of TikTok by federal workers on their government phones. There's 4,100 plus pages of stuff in this spending bill, and the timing is critical here, Caitlin. Members of Congress are here today, and they're here tonight. They want to get this vote done in the next 24 hours. Any number of members of the U.S. Senate want to get out of town before the weather hits in their home area, and Friday weather is hitting almost nationwide. So there's a timing issue here. But one footnote, I think it's important to underscore this. Not everybody in Congress is back in town, even though there are votes ongoing. You'll recall earlier this Congress, because of the COVID pandemic, they implemented this proxy voting system where members can vote remotely through a proxy and stay in their hometowns. Even though the pandemic has subsided a bit, they kept the proxy voting in place for a few more months. They'll do so through the end of this calendar year. So some of the people who would otherwise be here to hear President Zelenskyy are actually back home. So he won't have a full chamber. He won't have a full audience. And CBS News has confirmed the Speaker of the House told her members, no family, no guests, no retired or ex-members of Congress tonight. Just those who are sworn into the 117th Congress are permitted in the chamber.
Well, Scott, we're hearing security is going to be really intense up there as well. I mean, I know I've been on the border. I was on the border where our Secretary of State and their Foreign Secretary walked across the Polish border and literally took one step into Ukraine. And the hold on that was so incredibly tight and so paranoid. And that was, you know, a small, controllable group. Can you talk to us about some of the protocols that have gone into place around where his speech is going to be in the Capitol tonight?
Yeah, inside a controlled area, inside the U.S. Capitol grounds, they tightened the controls nonetheless. They've swept some of the streets outside of cars and vehicles and blocked traffic. There'll be a perimeter, almost State of the Union-like, around the U.S. Capitol to keep more people away who aren't credentialed. And I mentioned the limitations inside the chamber, perhaps for crowd control, perhaps because of security needs. They're limiting who can be there. Again, no families, no VIPs, no former members of Congress. That's who tends to infiltrate those seats and those doors during big events at the Capitol. So they've reduced kind of the footprint of people around President Zelenskyy. And all of this is a coordination effort. We know Capitol Police were notified late yesterday afternoon to begin their preparations for their part of synchronizing this security. But it works with multiple agencies. Secret Service is a piece of this, no doubt. The Department of State and its domestic security teams have some part of this as well. And all of this needed to be coordinated with precious little notice. As we reported earlier, word of this trip didn't get out to everybody involved till 24 hours ago.
That image, essentially, of a State of the Union address is certainly one that Zelenskyy wants to project, as we talked about. Christina Ruffini here at the desk and Scott McFarlane, thank you so much. We're going to take a quick break, but there's more ahead. You're streaming Red and Blue.
Everybody wakes up in the morning and they are pelted with alerts that frighten them, news that agitates them. With this show, we have the time to explain what's going on. These migrants, they've been released. Explain the status that allows them to be released, to slow things down a little bit. What are the big sets of questions for China and its ambitions? Hackers are stepping up their attacks to extort victims. Let's start with easy. Who's attacking? Here's a deeper understanding of what's happening.
Prime Time with John Dickerson. Stream on the free CBS News app. An original documentary from CBS reports tensions rising between a powerful country and a vital island.
The supply of this technology came grinding to a halt. The world would grind to a halt.
Absolutely. As Taiwan faces threats and aggression,
Taiwan is on the front line, and we understand our responsibility as a democracy. We cannot fall.
CBS News examines whether they can defend themselves.
Putin, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, they are manifestations of the battle between autocracy and democracy. And that is a fight that we're all engaged in.
Defending Taiwan, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme,
states from the plains to the northeast are bracing for more than 2 feet of heavy snow.
Every second counts.
This is a monster winter storm.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
There's a wrinkle in the forecast, the accumulating ice.
You'll have time to get prepared.
Take precautions before you head out.
Feel the forecast on the CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell.
Stories that inform.
You can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
After decades in the public eye and public service, this mother-daughter duo is now talking about gutsy women.
What's the gutsiest thing you've ever done?
We go person to person with Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton and Chelsea Clinton.
Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
In today's Money Watch, business analyst Jill Schlesinger is here to help.
How do you even begin to make the best use of your money?
If you've got a match from your employer, don't give away that money.
Dollar Jill, y'all.
CBS Mornings, starting at 7.
I think so that we have the same values and the same understanding of the life, the sense of the life. My message, I wish you peace. I think that is the main thing, and you understand it only when the war in your country, when somebody like these terrorists from Russia come to your houses.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns. That was, of course, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressing reporters earlier with President Biden. The two leaders met during Zelensky's first known trip abroad since the war in Ukraine began. So for more, let's bring in CBS News national security correspondent David Martin, who's at the Pentagon, CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini, who is here with me at the desk, and CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane, also in Washington. David, I want to start with you because the key moments coming from this presser that we heard were about what the U.S. is sending to Ukraine in terms of aid, in terms of resources, and also in terms of artillery. Can you tell us what exactly Ukraine is getting and what is involved?
Well, the total value of the package that was announced today is nearly $2 billion, $1.85 billion. But there are important new capabilities in that package. The most high profile of them and the most expensive of them being a battery of the Patriot air defense missile, which will, when it gets in operation, and it's going to take months to get it in full operation, will help Ukraine fend off these drone and missile strikes that are laying waste to its cities. But it's just one battery. So it's not going to protect all of Ukraine. It may be able to protect all or part of Kyiv, but that's about it. It's not a solution to the problem of all these incoming drones and missiles. In addition to that, the aid package contains an unspecified number of what are called smart bomb kits. And what they do is turn a dumb bomb, of which Ukraine has plenty, into a satellite-guided smart bomb, which a Ukrainian plane can then release from as far as 40 to 50 miles away from the target, and it will then glide in and strike the target with GPS accuracy. So that is a new capability that they haven't had. It's sort of an airborne equivalent of these HIMARS long-range rockets that the U.S. started supplying last summer, and which made such a big difference on the battlefield. And there's another part of the package, $800 million worth, in which they are simply buying old Soviet-caliber ammunition from countries around the world that they can then give to the Ukrainians to use in all of their old Soviet-era equipment and in some of the equipment they've captured from the Russians. They've captured quite a few tanks. They need ammunition for those tanks. The United States is going to pay a manufacturer to give that ammunition to the Ukrainians.
David, Caitlin asked you what's in the package, but I want to ask you what's not in the package, because we heard from President Zelenskyy he plans to ask for another Patriot missile battery. You just ran us through the limitations of having only one. But we heard from the final question was from a Ukrainian journalist who said, basically, why don't you give us all the things? So what are the things the U.S. isn't giving them that could potentially be available?
Longer range weapons. The fear is that if you give Ukraine a weapon that has the range to strike into Russia, Ukraine will strike into Russia. I mean, we've seen them launch a drone attack with one of their own drones at an air base not too far away from Moscow. If you gave them, for instance, F-16s, which is one of the weapon systems they are clamoring for, then they would have the capability to strike targets inside Russia. You can put all sorts of constraints on what you give them. You can say under no circumstances can you use these against the territory of Russia. But, you know, in a war, constraints have a way of falling away. So, and then, of course, a direct attack on Russian territory that was enabled by the United States giving the weapon to Ukraine. That in the Biden administration's calculation would risk starting a direct war with Russia, and that is for all the talk about defending Ukraine, defending Western values, the number one priority here, it remains not to start a direct war between the United States and Russia.
And David, on that note, I mean, the Biden administration has been very adamant about no U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine. But he also mentioned today that U.S. troops are going to help train to use some of these systems. Can you tell us a little bit about what that would look like, where it might be, what will be required of the U.S. military?
Well, the training will most likely take place in Germany, where there's a big U.S. training ground that has been used for decades and decades to train American troops, and where they've been training some Ukrainian troops already. But the standard training package for a Patriot crew is 10 months. Now, we're in wartime conditions, and you can compress that sum, and you don't have to teach them everything before you put that system into the field. But that's the kind of training that is involved. This is a high-tech system that is difficult, A, to operate, and B, to maintain. And of course, if you give them a weapon they can't maintain, then there's no point in giving them a weapon. You're talking about one battery here. A battery consists of 8 launchers. 8 launchers have, each launcher has 4 tubes in it. 8 times 4, 32. That's how many missile tubes we are providing Ukraine. Now, there'll be obviously reloads for those missile tubes, but this is not a game changer. This is an improvement in the air defenses that Ukraine has, and a hedge against Iran providing Russia with short-range ballistic missiles, because although Ukraine is getting very good at shooting down these Iranian drones, ballistic missiles travel much, much faster, and they are much, much harder to shoot down, and you need a Patriot to shoot down an incoming ballistic missile. So it's a hedge against the day, which many people think is coming, that Iran might.
David, one of the things we were talking about here at the desk, and neither of us, frankly, felt we had the capacity to answer, so we're going to bother you with it instead, is we're wondering if, where is the calculation between this drip, drip, drip of, eventual capitulation? Okay, we'll give you the heavier weapons. We'll give you the Patriot system. Maybe we'll give you a second. Zelenskyy says he's going to ask for it. Versus, to answer the Ukrainian journalist's question, why not give them everything now and end the war sooner? Is there a concern that if they don't step up with the weaponry, that this war will continue to drag on to a stalemate, to a point where it can't come to a resolution? Or is this just what we've got and this is how we're doing it and there's really no other alternative?
Well, if your bar is nothing that will provoke an escalation into a war with Russia, you're getting close to that bar now. There are other bars involved here. One is simply the capacity of the Ukrainians to absorb new technology. I mean, these are not soldiers who are sitting around their barracks with nothing to do. These are soldiers who are out in the field, manning air defenses now, who are going to have to be taken off the line and brought out of the country to learn how to operate this new system. So you can only do so many soldiers at a time without cutting into the combat capability that the Ukrainians need today. And there's another bar, which is the one that President Biden mentioned in his press conference, which is if you give the Ukrainians a weapon that might provoke a war with Russia, he could lose the unity of support that he has been able to build so far with all the other NATO countries.
And Scott, just quickly, we know that a lot of the funding has been decided by Congress. Can you tell us a little bit about, in this new Defense Authorization Act, did Congress give more money than was originally planned?
They're planning for the time ahead where funding's uncertain. Republicans take the House in a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, and funding becomes less certain. So they've squired away enough money for the military next year, more than expected originally, and foreign aid for 10 months.
All right. Scott McFarland, David Martin, and Christina Ruffini will be back with some more Red and Blue next.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
Yoga and wellness has become a place of anti-science.
Online clickbait.
The algorithms feed you content based upon your own fantasy.
Potentially at my peril.
There's no question about it.
Spreading digital disinformation.
Their entire yoga studio and spiritual community got so embedded in all of the QAnon stuff that it became a sick place.
Why pro-health